Welcome to Wait, What Do You Do Again? I'm your host, Meghan DeFord, and we are continuing our spooky season series this week with our guest, Dr. Bernice Murphy. Dr. Murphy is a professor of popular literature at Trinity College Dublin and one of the world's leading experts on Gothic and horror fiction. Today we're talking about Shirley Jackson's works, digging into why the lottery still rattles us 75 years later, and why being scared might actually be good for us. If you like this episode, hit subscribe, leave a review, and send it to a friend. I'd really appreciate it. Okay, let's go, if you dare. Dr. Murphy, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we dive into the lottery, could you share your area of study and how you got interested in it?
Yeah, I'm a professor in popular literature at Trinity College Dublin in Ireland. And that means that I have the great privilege of specialising in essentially the books that are really the most read, but that are often traditionally within academia the least talked about and the least looked at by myself and my fellow academics. So in particular, I specialise in horror and Gothic fiction. I also am increasingly working on true crime. With a colleague of mine called Claire Clark, we're doing a jointly edited book on true crime, a collection. I also would dabble a little bit in science fiction and fantasy thrillers, a little bit of everything. The one form of popular lit that I don't really engage with is romance, funnily enough, which students are often surprised that a male colleague of mine actually gives them lectures. Just very gendered assumptions there. But so that would be what I work in, and I've been doing that now. I got my job back in 2008, so I was very lucky to get that quite early on. The first ever lectureship in popular literature in the world, actually.
Wow.
So yeah, so I believe I've recently become the first professor in popular literature in the world. So I'm very fortunate to be in a place that really has recognized the importance of this subject area.
Yeah. And I mean, first of all, that sounds like an amazing job. Like, that's awesome.
It can be, yeah. Like every job there are its ups.
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course, of course. What were you always a reader? Like, what drew you to this?
Yeah, big time. I come from a family of readers on both sides. Both of my grandmothers inhaled books. And one grandmother was very into Zane Grey westerns. Very well. But yeah, I was from quite an early age, quite a morbid child, and I was very into horror, actually, as a teenager. And Stephen King, in a very genuine way, changed my life and led me to Shirley Jackson, because when I was about 15, I came across his excellent semi-autobiographical book, Dance Macabre, which is kind of a study of the horror genre. And he went on at such length about how wonderful Shirley Jackson's Hill House was that I had to seek it out. And you couldn't actually get her books in Ireland at that time. They were kind of out of print, or they weren't really on this side of the Atlantic. She was unknown. So a family friend kindly sent me over a copy from the US, and that changed my life. I ended up doing my PhD on Jackson, and if that hadn't happened when I was 16, I don't know what I would have done, but it wouldn't have been a PhD on Shirley Jackson.
Then
Couple of fortuitous events happened.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm just curious, did you grow up in Dublin or nearby?
No, I'm actually from the north of Ireland, so I would have grown up just in the border region during an interesting time before.
Yeah.
If you've ever seen Derry Girls, I was kind of the same age as those kids in it, except we're in a different part of the north.
Yeah.
So it was kind of an interesting place to grow up in, and yeah, it's very heavily militarized place, actually.
Do you feel like that? I had a friend who grew up in Derry, and
Oh, right, yeah, great city.
yeah. And I'm just curious, like, do you feel like that influenced you at all, or were you just naturally drawn toward horror and the macabre and
If you'd asked me when I was 25, I would have said absolutely not. But with the benefit of hindsight, I do think there possibly there was a little bit. I think I probably would have been inclined towards more sort of the macabre anyway. But I think there was a kind of a sense of escapism too in genre fiction in particular, and in horror.
Yeah.
I do think that was maybe an element there.
Yeah. It's interesting. So I will just tell you, I'm in awe of people who interact with horror and scary things. I am an absolute scaredy cat. And I've been thinking about it a lot recently. I grew up in a rural part of Maryland, which is near Washington, D.C. on the East Coast. And lots of woods, lots of things that go bump in the night.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Of course you know that. And I think it was too real, but I loved fantasy. Like, I loved that, and I feel like that escapism into the woods was safe and fun and an adventure, and not the, like,
Blair Witch Project. So I think it does impact you. So you found Shirley Jackson through Stephen King. What drew you to her work? Like, what was your first interaction?
Yeah, so I read Hill House and I thought it was really good. But then when I was a little bit older and I was casting about vaguely, I did an MA in literature in Queen's University in Belfast where I did my undergrad. And I was casting about vaguely, would I do a PhD? And then I again had to order from the US. I remember it was the first time I ever ordered a book from Amazon. So that's how long the late 90s. Little did we know what Amazon would become.
Yeah.
Anyway, I got a copy. We Always Lived in the Castle, and that absolutely blew my mind and decided, I need to look into this. And I realized that actually academically, very little of that. This was in 1999, 2000. Very little had been done. Now, some good work had been done, particularly there was a generation of feminist critics who came along in the 70s and the 80s who did invaluable work and really laid the foundations for Jackson studies. Incredibly important figures. And there was some good work, of course, by male critics as well. But particularly there were feminist critics who kind of recognized in Jackson concerns and preoccupations that were worth looking at. And I was really shocked when I realized that so little had been done. And in a way, kind of stumbled into it very naively. No one in my family had ever done a PhD. I mean, along with my cousins, I was part of the first generation. As in fairness, it was very common for my generation in Ireland at that time to go to university. So even getting an undergraduate degree was like a big deal. As quite rightly, it should be for any family.
Yeah.
I stumbled into a PhD, not really knowing what a PhD was. At Trinity College Dublin. I don't think I'd ever met anyone with a PhD apart from my professors in Queen's. So I was happily very naive, and I landed in exactly the right place at the right time in Trinity College with a wonderful supervisor, a chap called Professor Stephen Matterson, who's an American literature professor. And it was brilliant. It clicked for me that this was the thing that I wanted to do. So I was very fortunate.
You don't find too many people who stumble into a PhD. I love that. It's such monumental task. That's really wonderful, and I love that it clicked. When you were teaching Jackson, what do you find, whether it's your students or with your peers, what do you find that people are most surprised about her, whether as an author or just even personal?
I think one thing that I always try to highlight and that students are sometimes surprised by is how funny Jackson is. She kind of had the soul of a comedian, I think, in a lot of ways. This extends to her personal writings, her letters, her lectures. She's really funny. And even in her darkest books, there were very funny moments. Like there are hilarious scenes and We've Always Lived in the Castle. In The Haunting Hill House, there are really, really funny moments. And in many of her stories are infused with this kind of dark comedy that is there. So I think that can come as a surprise to people in particular, because there can be a little bit of a perception of Jackson as kind of like this kind of like poor Shirley figure. There's a little bit of a troubling narrative that often attaches itself to successful women writers and creative artists, that they had very sad lives and terrible husbands. And so they were kind of, and Jackson certainly had her troubles. I don't want to sugarcoat that. But she was also someone who really enjoyed making people laugh and was very, very, very funny. So I she's got a novel called The Sundial, which actually is one of the funniest things she ever wrote. But it's a novel about the end of the world. Jackson. So that's one thing I think that sometimes surprises students actually is how funny she is.
Yeah.
How diverse she is, the range of what she could do. People think of Jackson, they think of The Lottery and they think of Hill House, understandably. But actually, even across the 6 novels that she published and her dozens of short stories, there's a great deal of depth and variety there,
Yeah. Yeah. And how did she come to this genre?
Do you mean horror specifically, or?
Yeah, I mean, and it's funny, you literally just said the range of her work. She got to it. And specifically the horror genre. And one of the things that for listeners, I reached out to Dr. Murphy because of The Lottery. I was like, you know what, that is such a short story that has affected my life. I mean, I read it at least once a year around Halloween. It's so disturbing. Everyone I've sent it to is like, oh my God. And I was like, I know, right? And so when I was looking for experts, that's how I came across your information, and was so excited when I read your resume. And I don't know that much about Jackson. Like, how did she, for a woman at that time, how did she come to this genre that I'm making an assumption here was probably male dominated in terms of horror?
Yeah, and I don't know that she necessarily would have thought of herself explicitly as a horror writer.
Mhm.
I think that's something that was kind of I wouldn't say projected
Onto her.
unnecessarily, because she clearly did write works of horror. I mean, most famously Hill House and The Lottery. But that certainly wasn't the only thing she did. So I think that she would have just thought of herself as a writer. It was drawn to certain kinds of, like, she was from an early age drawn to things like magic and tarot and the occult. She liked a bit of true crime. Apparently, I was talking to one of her grandkids too, saying that. She was someone who had a particular set of interests that I think would have maybe gravitated towards that the more macabre side of things. But unlike, say, the male, you're talking about the male dominated genre of the time, it certainly, when it comes to more explicit expressions of American genre writing in the 50s and 60s, a lot of the most prominent writers in those veins were men. There were people like Robert Bloch, or obviously Ray Bradbury would be famous, or Richard Matheson, who actually has a lot in common with Jackson. And it would have started off really much more so than her working in a very, I think, self-consciously horror or science fiction or fantasy vein. And that wasn't the case for Shirley. Shirley, right from the outset, was publishing in very non-genre magazines. She did publish in genre magazines as well. Like, she was publishing the likes of the New Yorker in for the early to mid 40s. Even before The Lottery, people forget she appeared in the New Yorker. So I think it's more that I don't think she explicitly would have said, I'm going to set out to write a horror story. It's just the way her head worked.
Yeah.
You know, it gets different when she comes to Hill House, because she's very, very, obviously very deliberately setting out to write her version of a haunted house story.
Mhm.
So she's very deliberately setting out to write in a particular kind of register. Whereas I don't think with The Lottery, she was explicitly thinking, I'm going to write one of the most disturbing stories ever written, and traumatized generations of American high schoolers. From what I understand, that
Yes.
managed to do that. You just,
It's great. It's really great. So we'll start with The Lottery, and you know, if you haven't read it, you can still read it in the New Yorker. It was published in 1948, and there was a very strong reaction to it. Why do you think it caused this sort of outrage and commotion at the time? And yeah, we'll just start there.
I think a large part of it, I mean, it's an exceptional story, number one. I mean, it genuinely, even when I assign it to students these days, I'm like, don't read anything about it, just read it and then tell me what you think. And they will have a reaction. Like, boy, will they have a reaction, which is great. Like, because you're never quite sure how, particularly what they would consider to be very old material.
Right.
Anything from before 2015. I'm joking, but only slightly. It is a world away from them in many respects, but it packs a punch. I think the publication medium was really important. Like, this appeared in the New Yorker, kind of middle brow America's, most august cultural organ of the time, and probably
Yeah.
still. And people were not necessarily expecting to turn the pages in the New Yorker and find a tale of. Yeah, I should say here, if you're a reader or a listener who hasn't read The Lottery, I'm going to spoil it for you, so you should maybe stop
Yeah,
and
just
read.
like go forward a couple.
About a woman getting stoned to death by her friends and neighbors as part of a harvest ritual. It's not
Casual.
And it also starts off in kind of a deceptively, like, it's a clear and sunny day on June 27th. It's like the kids are playing. Oh, they're playing with pebbles. You go back and read it later on and go, oh my God, they're playing with pebbles. So it sort of, it has this also very calm kind of register in which it's written, and this gradually building sense of, well, what is this lottery? What's she going to win? Apparently, there was someone who wrote to Jackson and said that they thought that she was going to be, there used to be a TV show made called Queen for a Day, where a house would be given like lots of prizes. This would happen to poor old Tessie. So I think actually the publication venue was really important. If this had been published in a explicitly genre magazine, where you would have had a readership who was, used to reading stories by people like Richard Matheson, etc., I don't think it wouldn't have had nearly the same impact, and it wouldn't have reached nearly the same audience. But this is an out and out horror story in the New Yorker, and people were not prepared for that.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. It's absolutely not what you're expecting to read. And it's interesting what you said about your students. I have two kids who unironically say I was born in the 1900s, and I'm like, technically, you're correct. But even when you start the story, it feels like some sort of old time, like, what is this community? It feels very like dated. And it feels very Midwestern to me, in the sense of like, very polite, very calm, that sort of feel, and then it really takes a turn.
See through that you used the word Midwestern there, and I think that's really important too. If this had been a story about exactly the same ritual carried out in a foreign locale,
Mm-hmm.
or in a explicitly bygone time,
Mm-hmm.
again, I don't think it would have created the same reaction. These are recognizably, American.
Yes.
We don't know when it takes place or where it takes place, but we know it's somewhere in America.
Right. Right.
And that's really important. And they're recognizable. And Jackson actually, in very few of her texts, ever said where anything was set or said what year it was. It's very rare that she does that. So the lottery keeps to that. But you know that it's recognizably contemporary kind of America.
Right. Right.
And I think that adds to horror. Like, how could this happen over here?
Exactly. Themes we're thinking about right now, actually. Definitely area. And
I will say the lottery gets used an awful lot. I have a Google search sorry for interrupting, Meg, but I've Googled the lottery as a search term. And one of my students, shout out to Janice, who's now starting a postdoc on Jackson. Janice has as well. And Janice has pointed out the extent to which the lottery is used as a poorly misunderstood metaphor for American political commentators. They'll always say, it's like something out of the lottery. And then it becomes really clear they haven't read the lottery in about 20 years.
Yeah.
But she's actually become a shorthand, that story, for certain developments in American politics, which is concerning.
Yeah. Yeah. As someone sitting in Florida right now, tell me about it.
Yeah.
So Jackson had been published in the New Yorker prior to this.
Yep.
Was the New Yorker taking any sort of risk with this? Or it seems, again, to your point, and I just thought about this while you were talking, in a genre magazine, there's no risk with it. Like, those people or the readers are coming there for that. Was this sort of typical for the New Yorker, or was this something that, maybe could have caused some backlash to them?
I mean, it's sometimes overlooked that the New Yorker has been an incubator for many of America's great writers, including Jackson. I mean, it had published stories of sort of like what you might call with genre elements in them, certainly picked up by male authors. That wasn't uncommon.
Mhm.
I'm thinking of, the writer John Cheever.
Yes.
John Cheever published stories that had fantastical elements in it. Like, there's one called The Great Big Radio, which is a great one about a guy that can tune into what's happening in other apartments and sort of. But
Yeah.
so I don't think they necessarily thought they were making that it was going to be risky. What is clear is that they didn't know what it was about. They were like, it's a story by Shirley, and she'd always written stuff that was a bit off kilter anyway.
Yeah.
And so there was a sense that it didn't really depart too much from what she had already was starting to gain a name for. And so I don't think they thought that it would have the reaction that it did. And I don't know if knowing the often quite angry and bewildered response, would they have maybe reconsidered? But then, of course, it created publicity it got into newspapers, it created publicity. So I suppose that would have been a good thing.
Right.
But no, I mean, they didn't get it. They didn't know. And subsequently, James Thurber was writing, I think it was an article about the history of the New Yorker. The writer James Thurber wrote to Jackson to ask her to explain the genesis of the lottery and how the New Yorker reacted. And she basically said, yeah, they didn't really, that they had asked her after the outroar to put in a couple of lines explaining what the story was about. Suggesting to her what the story was about. And it was something along the lines of, the persistence of ritual in modern life or something like that. And she was like, yeah, fine, that's what it's about.
Sure.
They were kind of like, they didn't really know what they were dealing with, I suppose. Understandably, in that it is a genuinely upsetting kind of devastating. And the more you read it, actually, I think it's one of the stories that the second time you read it, it's more upsetting because you know exactly, and you know how all the deceptively idyllic bits at the start are just awful when you know what the lottery actually is.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, thinking about it in the timeline of, this is post World War II, but not that far away from it, and the horrors that happened, and that we participated in as humans, so I'm sure that was, readers were still grappling with that and reeling from that and healing from that. Where would you put this? Where would you put the lottery in terms of her other works? And I guess, her broader works, how does the lottery fit into them?
Well, it's one thing is it's very common in Jackson for community activities.
Mm-hmm.
have unpleasant consequences. And there's a nice bit of symmetry in that the final published book of her career, We've Always Lived in the Castle, also features stone throwing and a violent rural mob.
Mhm.
Jackson was actually, I mean, I wrote an article about this years ago, but I stand by it. She was a real snob, actually, in some respects, about working class rural people. And some of the lines in her letters where she's kind of been a little bit snooty about the people in Bennington, they didn't know, North Bennington, I should say, in Vermont, they didn't know at the community that she lived in for most of her adult life. She didn't always necessarily have a high opinion of the location and some of her neighbours. She got on really well with some of them, but some of them she didn't. Um, so there's a consistent thread in her stories of outsiders in a big house on a hill with sort of potentially resentful villagers surrounding them. And that comes to fruition in We've Always Lived in the Castle. There's elements of that in one of her other books from 1958, The Sundial,
Mhm.
villagers and tension between them and the people in the big house. And in Hill House, of course, the villagers quite rightly will have nothing to do with Hill House because they know it's a bad deal.
Right.
Actually very sensible. So there is that sense too of when communities act together in unison. This goes back to her first book, actually, which is often forgotten about and still actually very little read to this day. There's still been very little written about it. It's a book called The Road Through the Wall, published within months of the lottery. And it's set in a suburban community in 1936. The only time in any of her novels, she says, where a novel is set and what year it is. So it's 1936 in Northern California. And it's a community that comes together in almost like a kind of a witch hunt against a 13-year-old boy because a little girl in the community has been found dead and she's believed to have been murdered. So there's actually really interesting connections between the lottery. I wouldn't be the first critic to point this out. Between the lottery and We've Always Lived, or sorry, The Road Through the Wall. So it's actually, across the board, she's actually remarkably consistent thematically. Stuff you see earlier on in her career. She does different things with it, but she's really thematically consistent.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And she's consistent about. I will say too, she's got a great story from the mid-19, I think it's 54, called The Summer People, which
Mhm.
if you like the lottery, read The Summer People. It actually makes a really good companion piece because it's about a New York couple who go and stay in a rural community by the side of a lake. But they decide to stay after Labor Day, which apparently is this great faux pas. And they
Don't
find,
do it.
I know, I think Labor Day means a lot more to Americans than it does to me. Because my first friend, I was like, I don't know what Labor Day is, but I think it's the first of September, isn't it? I think
Right, right. It's like the unofficial end of summer. Yeah.
you're not meant to wear white or before it or after it or
Correct.
something.
Yes.
But long story short, once they stay, they start to suspect, and you're never quite sure, typical Jackson, if it's in their heads or if it's actually happening, that the community don't want them there and that
Mm.
they're kind of becoming trapped there. And it makes it really interesting. So it's all a very convoluted way of saying she's very, in particular, her depiction of rural communities is quite consistent. And her her depiction of groups of people coming together is often really, really negative.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what's so interesting about her is her works is that she does use the domestic and she does use the small community, something that we've all interacted with to create that unease. Like, why do you think that works so well?
Well, I think in a way it's because it's, things that we all probably have interacted with in our life at one point, um, like one of the most famous scenes in Hill House is someone waking up in bed and being really scared because they've heard banging on the door, grabbing the hand of what they think is the person next to them and holding their hand and then realized nobody else was there. Whose hand was I holding is the famous line. And that moment of like, can you trust your own perceptions? Can you trust, are you being misled by something supernatural or something external? Is the problem with you? And I think similarly, like she was actually, like the domestic in a way was kind of her great project. And it's part of the reason why, let's face it, male critics who dominated academia up until
Sure.
about, 10 years ago.
Right.
It's an exaggeration. But I mean, up until certainly arguably the 2000s, because she was interested in particularly the lives of women, the lives of children in families. And this, and she wrote, I don't know if you're aware of this, she wrote some very successful, humorous family stories for the women's magazine market. And the interesting thing about those stories is for many years, they were kind of considered to be a separate thing, like a thing she did for money that had nothing to do really with Nobody really bothered to look at them. Still actually not a lot written about them, funnily enough. But they are very similar in register to, very similar to a lot of the stuff she does in the more explicitly horrific work she does. It's just that the tone is different. So she recognized the potential in everyday life. And I think The Ladder is a great example of this, that with a little twist of the knife, you could take something that seems perfectly ordinary and everyday and make it a bit strange, a bit uncanny, which is really good at that too, or make it overtly horrific. And
Yeah.
I think that's again something she's very consistent about.
Yeah. And it's interesting because as scary as a werewolf or a clown living in the sewer or like those sort of things are, there's something inside of us that knows that's either not real or not something I'm going to experience, right? Like that's entertainment versus I think what she does so beautifully is this could happen to you. Like this, we've all been in those situations where you're like, did I see that? Did I hear that? Did I, and it's usually in your house, it's in the workplace or in your car or whatever. You've written about, and I want to make sure I get this right, suburban Gothic.
Yes, that was my first book, my first.
Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote it in like about 20 years ago now, which shocks me, but it was published in 2009. The suburban Gothic in American popular culture. I wanted to call it Disturbia, but the publishers wouldn't let me.
Oh,
Yeah, in academic, quite rightly, in academia, you have to have very blandly declarative title. That's fair enough. Long story short, it's a book that grew out of my thesis on Jackson. I had a chapter about haunted houses, and I was particularly interested in The Road Through the Wall, which is a precursor to really the suburban set horror stories of the 1950s. And I realized that actually, a bit like with Jackson, practically nothing there'd been one article written about suburban Gothic explicitly, but there were actually lots and lots of really interesting texts that fell into this, what I grew to realize was a distinct category, where there was a focus on the suburban lifestyle, the effects of the suburban lifestyle, the perception that the suburban lifestyle was inherently kind of bad for people, and particularly bad for women and for families, and that the suburb had become this kind of new locale for horror. That it was no longer, the cabin in the woods or the the creepy old castle on the hill. That actually a lot of them, it was even more terrifying because it seems as if a suburban house doesn't have a history. It's new. There shouldn't be a ghost in a suburban house. But of course, if you've ever seen Poltergeist, you know, which is kind of the most beautifully straightforward example of suburban Gothic you can get in your life is Poltergeist. You literally have skeletons popping up through the family swimming pool while the golden retriever looks on. So yeah, that was, and Jackson was part of that. Her book, The Road Through the Wall, I suggest that it is one of the foundational American suburban Gothic texts, along with Richard Matheson, who's a writer I really like as well. He did a great book called I Am Legend, which is a vampire zombie tale set in suburban LA. And so yeah, that was where suburban Gothic kind of took me.
yeah.
It got me a job, so I'm not complaining.
That's great. And I love the name Disturbia. I think that's awesome. So Gothic roots, and correct me if I'm wrong on this timing, Gothic roots started in the 18th and 19th century, or was it prior to that?
Yeah, I mean, arguably, the desire to tell scary and unsettling stories is as old as time.
Sure,
But
sure.
in a practical, real world publishing world sense, the Gothic begins in particularly in England, actually in the 18th century, and even from the beginning, actually, there's a one of the biggest authors of about 10 or 15 year in is a woman called Anne Radcliffe, who was kind of the godmother of the Gothic in a way, along with someone like Mary Shelley. So women had a very dominant role. I mean, there were male authors too who were very important. People like Horace Walpole, who wrote the novel, which is generally considered the first, like the blueprint for everything else that followed, called The Castle of Otranto, which is metal. It gets an interesting reaction. So that's where it kind of began. There was stuff going on in Europe as well. And then the Gothic, there's an American Gothic that emerges. But of course, you're in America. A lot of the classical European Gothic, particularly in England, was informed by a fear of Catholics and foreigners and foreign Catholics coming over to England and doing dodgy things because, they're foreign and they're Catholic. But there's a bit of Catholic phobia going on. You often had like sinister nuns and priests and ruined abbeys and things like that, and old castles and things. And an aristocracy was really important, but you don't have any of that stuff in America.
Mm-hmm.
It is, from a white Anglo-European perspective, not accurately, it is supposedly a new world. So you have to find a new form of Gothic, and that's where the American Gothic comes from. A chap called Charles Brockden Brown has a lot to do with that. But arguably goes back to the Puritans and their, captivity narrative. There's a woman called Mary Rowlandson who wrote an account of being kidnapped. Her whole family and her village were attacked by a native, really, really, really angry Native Americans. They're in escalating conflict, and her community was destroyed. She was kidnapped, and her account is incredibly harrowing and upsetting. It's also incredibly sensationalist and bloody, and it was actually the equivalent of a Puritan bestseller. Everyone was reading this. It's one of the most read books in colonial America, and it's often taken as kind of the accidental beginning of almost like American Gothic as well. I've seen it argued that she's the first American final girl, which is maybe a little bit, but she survived while everybody else, was hacked to death. So Mira Rowlandson, it's on Project Gutenberg, and it's not that long actually. It's only about 5,000 words.
We've talked about Europe and we've talked about the United States. Did Gothic spread to other cultures, whether in Asia, massive Asia, Africa, South America?
Everywhere. It's absolute. Gothic is universal.
Yeah.
And one of the really interesting things and one of the heartening things in Gothic studies in the last 20 years is that it's become we've got an International Gothic Association. There's about 300 of us in it. It goes from strength to strength. And also you're seeing more and more people coming in from, say, I've met academics working on, say, Gothic in Thailand. There's increasing numbers of scholars from India, which is incredible, coming over and talking about there. And they, of course, there are actually just quite a few, say, British colonial Gothic stories written from the perspective like, oh, he's the white settler who's like going, oh, I'm in India and everything's really scary. And the really interesting thing is you get the Indian academics, and you're looking at stories that are written from the Indian perspective about the British. And it's absolutely fascinating. And of course, Ireland has its own very strong Gothic tradition. I mean, Bram Stoker, who went to my own university, we invented mom vampires, basically, the Irish.
Really?
Well, we didn't invent them, but we invented, Dracula was created by Irishman. Carmilla, which is an incredibly influential text, was also an Irishman, a chap called G.S. Lefanu, who was also associated with Dublin. So yeah, we actually we made a big global impact, not to promote our own country, but we're
do it. I love it.
Big deal vampire wise, so
that's awesome. And are there through lines? Are there through lines cross culturally with the Gothic genre? Does it have to meet certain requirements?
No, I mean, I think that the good thing about it as well is one thing I like about genre fiction is there were certain things that tend to recur again and again, like the basic line that's often repeated about the Gothic is that it's the return of the repressed. That which you don't wish to acknowledge or address or deal with will always come back in the most convenient way possible. And so that adapts itself, I think, to any circumstance you can possibly think of. It could be an overtly horror story about a clown in a sewer in a town that's full of child abuse even before perpetrated by the actual humans in the town. Like Derry's a terrible place to live. I should say not Derry, north of Ireland.
Correct.
That's a good place to live now. But Derry, Maine, it's not a good place to live. Even if you didn't have Pennywise in the sewers, he's kind of a metaphorical in a way, But also more subtle things, like what Jackson did in a lot of her work, where the real fear is like in Hill House, that line again, whose hand was I holding? There's an incredible line at the end of, if you're familiar with Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, which is a very big influence on Jackson's Hill House. And there's a moment where the governess, who thinks she's trying to save children from terrible, creepy ghosts, has a moment of self-reflection where she knows she's gone too far, potentially. And she says, essentially the line is, what am I? She certainly has a moment where she realizes if she's not right about this supernatural thing that she thinks is going on, she's the real monster here. And it's this moment of, and it kind of goes away then, but there's this horrible moment of self-reflection and awareness. And I think that's at the heart of a lot of the Gothic in particular, where horror will usually go to the monster, going more explicitly, but Gothic in many ways tends to be a bit more inferior. Not to say that the horror can't be as well, and the lines are very blurred as well between.
Sure. This is a huge question, but why do you think people like to be scared, and I guess in particular in uncertain times? I think it's interesting how we take these large ideas, just like you were speaking about, and you place them into a place in time. Like, I am now very fascinated by I'm one of the things that I absolutely loved is learning about the East India Company. I think that whole time period is like just fascinating. So now I need to go look at books from that time that are Gothic. But why do we like to be scared, and what does it help us get through when we're dealing with uncertainty, especially on a mass scale that we may not be able to influence, like the Cold War or insert big issue here?
I mean, I will say that sometimes when I tell people who don't know me what I do and the kind of stuff I specialize in, you occasionally get a look that's kind of like, oh, okay. What went around in your childhood? You know, that kind of thing. Um, my sense, and I'm quite biased here, is that actually, because I hang around with a very live and vibrant community of not just horror scholars, but horror fans, is that psychologically, I think actually it can be really, really healthy for you. I think that the argument that's often given to the extent that it's maybe a bit of a cliche, but I think like a lot of cliches, it contains truth in it, is the idea that horror is cathartic. That, you know, Stephen King has that great line, you know, we make up fictional horrors to help us cope with the real horrors.
Mm.
And I think that there's undoubtedly a lot of truth in that. I really think. I think actually the reasons why people engage, particularly women engage with true crime, are very, very similar. I think there's a huge amount of overlap there of a sense of like, I'll engage with this media, be it a book, a film, a podcast, in a controlled environment of my choosing, and it will maybe distract me, or it will entertain me, or it will kind of take me away from maybe something other. I mean, one of the things that struck me is I teach courses in horror very regularly and true crime as well, and a film that I always warn my students about, you know, I'm going, listen, we're doing something a bit rough next week, you know, well, rough, you know, you'll go from like The Conjuring, which is, you know, PG-13. It's effective jump scares, but ideologically very troubling. I have real problems with the valorization of Ed, and particularly Ed Warren was a very particular character. But anyway, they really Hereditary. I've taught both Midsommar and Hereditary, Ari Aster's two films, two of the more significant horror films of the last 10 years. And both of them, I don't know if you've seen them, Meghan, they're both exceptionally upsetting.
Yeah, no, I haven't.
I mean, you know, I've been watching horror since, you know, all kinds of stuff that maybe from a young age that I probably shouldn't have been watching in retrospect. Thank God the internet hadn't reached South Armagh at that stage where
Right.
you know, but when I saw Hereditary in the cinema, there's a scene in it where I left out and went, oh, Jesus Christ. And they genuinely, particularly during the pandemic, students were saying to me in all sincerity that things like, oh, Hereditary is my comfort film, or Midsommar, which looks beautiful. It's
Beautifully shot. Yes, yes.
awful things happen. It's also very funny, I think, which is part of the film's appeal. I wouldn't say Hereditary's funny though, but and again, I think it goes back to that idea that when you're watching the worst unfold on screen, or watching the worst case scenario, like a lot of modern horror is actually incredibly grim and incredibly grim endings. Like there's a real trend towards the downer horror film in recent years. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's almost like a kind of, well, here's something that's worse than the way things are going in real life.
Yeah.
You know, and that's really depressing. But I do think for the kids I'm teaching, who of course we get older students as well, but many of them would be between say 19 and 22 or so, and it's not a great time to be that age, no matter where in the world you are. So I think horror actually can play quite an important role.
Yeah.
I would never expect people to. I think the idea of forcing someone to watch a horror film, you know, there are some people I know who genuinely, I'm sure you know people like this too, it genuinely really upsets and troubles them, and it's just not for them.
Yeah.
And it's you know, sometimes people be like with kids who be like, oh, you need to toughen up and watch this. I get asked for recommendations for kids for horror films all the time. I'll always say, listen, I need to know about your child first, because they could be, you know, you know, I think you have to be careful about these things. I'm certainly not pro censorship, but I think everyone's got their own appropriate level.
Yeah, I agree with you. And as someone, you know, I kid that I'm a scaredy cat, but I'm very serious about your media diet, and I have no issue with, hey, if Hereditary is your comfort film, awesome. Mine is When Harry Met Sally. But I am that person who's very sensitive, and I know, like, I had to stop watching Law and Order, which was a comfort show for me when I was pregnant. And I was like, I can't watch this. Like, this happens to people. And it's, you know, so Law and Order is certainly not horror in terms, but I'm just very sensitive to it. So I know that about myself. But anyway, do you find, have you done any work, or any of your colleagues, or maybe even your students thinking about the Gothic and horror genres and social media. Like when I was thinking about this conversation, I was thinking about the lottery in the context of like social media, cancel culture, like how we kind of attack people online. There's, it's certainly different, but has there been any thought about that?
Oh, I think the closest example I can think of is there's a brilliant book from about 7 or 8 years ago that I think still holds true, called by a British journalist called John Ronson. It's called "So Now You've Been Publicly Shamed," and he wrote it about the kind of the first, I guess you would call it the first wave, back when Twitter was still Twitter rather than whatever the hell it is
It's
now.
still Twitter.
I have thoughts, but I will not express them. Right. But it's about kind of that first wave of people who got fired because they said ill-judged things on Twitter.
Sure.
Sometimes actively offensive, sometimes just things that people thought were funny and were for a particular like audience of close friends. And he particularly starts off the book by talking about that really kind of awful case where in many respects, where a young woman was at a long-haul flight and she made a joke about she was going to a country in Africa, and she made a stupid joke that was some sort of in-joke in her office. I can't remember it exactly, but it was certainly a joke that I think understandably could be perceived as it was quite offensive. And by the time she got off the plane, she had been sacked. Her life had essentially been ruined. She'd been pilloried. And it's actually a very humane book. But the example he uses, he comes back to, if memory serves, with a few years that I read it. He uses the example of like the Puritan, the Puritan idea of shaming, and that there's like sort of like a collective mob excitement, and particularly with that case, people were following what was happening on Twitter and tracking her flight and things like that. And, so she had no internet access. And by the time she got off the plane, she was just on her phone, and her life is basically exploded because of this, admittedly silly, ill-judged thing, but not something arguably I think that should have necessarily ruined one's. And certainly Ronson makes a very compelling case that this woman, it was really over the top.
Yeah.
So I think that idea of there's a sort of a gang up mentality is something that arguably has echoes in the lottery as well. I mean, I think it's really careful too. I think sometimes there are attitudes that arguably deserve to be pilloried. That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
But I think the idea that and certainly cancel culture, if it worked as well as it's supposed to work, there are, I think, things that will perhaps be slightly different now.
Yeah.
So it's I think I could see how one could make that kind of maybe that kind of metaphorical parallel.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not a perfect fit necessarily.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, we've seen it here in the States in the last, I'd say, 2 weeks, where people immediately started going after each other. And then within hours, it was like, wait, what? Like, that's not what we thought we're talking about, So it's the rate of speed of social media. I'll have to read that, of being in a plane, making some insensitive comment, which sounds like Twitter, and then get off the plane, and your whole life, it sounds like something out of the Twilight Zone, right?
Green case, but I'm sure we can all think of more recent cases where essentially lost their jobs instantly because they've put something ill-judged online.
Yeah.
And I think that immediacy is not a healthy thing. I don't think any of us should necessarily be putting our unfiltered online in any capacity. I certainly don't want mine. It's bad enough sometimes having to give a lecture. Thank you. And that's a very structured environment. But I think when the consequences can be so severe, particularly for ordinary people, the consequences can be so severe.
Yeah, absolutely. This is just such a fun conversation. What would you say, first of all, what would you say is your favorite Jackson piece, and why?
Oh, it's definitely We've Always Lived in the Castle, 1962, tragically her final published novel. And I just think it's one of the greatest American novels ever written. It's both delightful and really disturbing, which is the best way I could describe it. I don't want to say too much about it, but for those who haven't read it, it's a really good gateway Jackson. I very deliberately teach it to our second years every year, and without fail, I will get a succession of students coming up to me going, "This is my new favorite."
I love it. I love that.
What does I'd like to think that's due to the incredible rhetorical power of the lecture I've given? It's not. It's because the book is really, really, really good. It's just a fabulous book. And it's one of those books too that when I first read it as like a 20-year-old, I very much empathize with the narrator who is writing, and she's an 18-year-old and she's speaking in the aftermath 6 years before. Her family, all of her family, apart from her sister and her uncle, have mysteriously been poisoned at the dinner table with us.
Hmm.
And that's all I want to say. I mean,
Sure.
that's giving away anything. It's literally in the first paragraph of the novel. And as I got older, I was empathizing more and more with her older sister, who is dealing with this younger sister, who is an interesting and arguably a challenging character.
Yeah.
I think her name is Mary Cat Blackwood, and I think she's one of the most interesting American characters ever created. And I think it's so good because you find yourself sympathizing so much with her. She's such a beguiling narrator. It only gradually starts to hit you how disturbing the book actually is, and all the things happening in the background. And one of the things Jackson has done is she stripped away huge amounts of information. So, and what we are learning is being filtered through this character who's got a very particular perspective on the world and a very unique view on the world. So I always recommend that one. I think it's a book that I've read about, I must have read it 25 times. I mean, I teach it at least once a year. And I could happily read it 25 more times right now. So that would be my favorite, definitely.
That's great. That's it. Something about what you just said reminded me when I read The Silent Patient, and looking back on it, I was like, I should have known. Once you figure out what's happening, you're like, oh no. And by the way,
I think it's a book that's been ripped off of her.
I was gonna say, yeah, I was just familiar.
Or I should say maybe that's an unkind way of putting it. It's been a huge influence on contemporary psychological, particularly literary psychological thrillers.
Yes.
There are many Mary Cat Blackwood style characters. And I think Jackson is, her influence on contemporary modern writing is absolutely huge. And that's one of the real ones that has really made an impact.
And it's so interesting that you say that, because I don't think, and I'm 42 years old, so maybe it's changed, but I don't feel like she is taught in American modern literature in any sort of way that is appropriate given her influence. I don't know why that is. I mean, I don't want to make any assumptions about it. Do you think it's about like the style that she wrote, or just, I don't get it.
I think she's, one of the things about Jackson is she's actually an immensely more complicated and sophisticated writer than she could sometimes at first seem. Like a story like The Lottery, or a novel like We've Always Lived in the Castle, is written in such a perfectly calibrated, elegant way that it seems easy. It's very easy to read.
Yeah.
But it's also incredibly sophisticated. She really knew what she was at, and she knew what she was at very early on in her career. Like, she nearly hit the ground running, in her late 20s, really. Or even from her first published story when she was at college, which is a really upsetting little vignette about a girl who has tried to take her own life, but then is ringing up all her friends and telling them about it in the very, so I tried to kill myself today. And it's pure Jackson right from the outset. So I think part of it is that she's actually a very sophisticated writer. I think part of it is that she has been, and this happened immediately in her career when The Lottery was published, she's reduced just down to the author of The Lottery. Like, literally, when she knew that, she wrote essays about this. She said, it's the one, I've been told it's the one story people would remember me for. When she died in August 1965, 10 days later, obituary appears in the New Yorker. First line or headline of the obituary is, Shirley Jackson, author of horror classic, dies. So literally, The Lottery was a horror classic, which is interesting there. So the perception came that she only wrote horror, and that The Lottery was the best thing she ever did. And because in particular it used to get taught, I don't know, I do wonder now if, with concerns about exposing kids to certain kind, I do think kids should be exposed to challenging material. I think it's incredibly important once it's pitched in the right way. But I do wonder if maybe there's a little bit of I wouldn't be familiar enough with what's happening in American high schools now, but I know that it's not uncommon for The Lottery to be banned.
Interesting, yeah.
The graphic novel, her grandson Miles Hyman did a beautifully illustrated graphic novel of The Lottery, and it was banned, I believe, in Texas a few years ago. Not because it ends with a woman getting stoned to death, because there was a scene with a woman in a bath. So apparently it was due to female nudity was considered
Well,
so God forbid kids should be exposed to that kind of thing. So yeah, I think there's maybe a sense of like, people aren't all. My experience is that if people do know of Jackson, they only know of The Lottery and maybe Hill House. That's it. And I will say that the TV show although there's good things about it, I don't want to slag it off. The Mike Flanagan TV show of Hill House gives people completely the wrong idea because it's not an adaptation of Hill House. It's very loosely inspired by it. There's bits made me want to punch a hole in a wall, particularly. The premise of it is that a man has written The Haunting of Hill House, a male character.
Yeah.
Are you aware too that there was a film in which Jackson is a character called Shirley in 2020?
No.
Yeah, I was. If I can complain about that for.
Please.
This is when I knew that the Jackson Renaissance, as we call it in Jackson studies, the Shirley Renaissance, was really becoming a big thing when there's a film made in which Shirley Jackson is a main character. So this is based on a book from 2014. It is a novel, to be clear, by a writer called Susan Scarf Merrill called Shirley. And it's a novel. It's sort of a fictionalized version of Jackson and her husband. And in real life, there were disappearances in and around Bennington College. It became known as the Bennington Triangle. You might have heard of it. There were something like 5 or 6 mysterious disappearances that happened. And there were rumors that maybe there was some kind of serial killer or aliens was one theory. But a young woman at Bennington College disappeared at the time that Jackson and her husband, when they were there for 20 years. But long story short, this is a fictionalized kind of psycho thriller. So the film stars Elizabeth Moss as Shirley Jackson, which is really interesting. Elizabeth Moss coming off like The West Wing, Mad Men, of course, in her iconic performance as Peggy, and then, of course, The Handmaid's Tale, and then she plays Shirley, which is interesting casting in itself, given, Moss's associations with kind of these figures who fight back against patriarchy. Right. I think her performance and that of her co-star, the guy who plays Michael Stuhlbarg, who plays Shirley's husband, Stanley, he's actually incredible. He's really good. But the story perpetuates this sense of Jackson as this very witchy figure. She's spooky. She's witchy. She does things like she pours wine on a white sofa at a party because she doesn't like the hostess. She's kind of a bitch, if I'm going to use that in the film.
Yeah.
And also, it focuses very much, it sort of moves her. She did have struggle with anxiety and depression throughout her life, particularly in the early 1960s, had a very, very serious period of being unwell.
Mm-hmm.
Severely agoraphobic. The film kind of could date up back to the early 50s. Long story short, it perpetuates, I think, a lot of the slightly reductive stereotypes about Jackson, and also about other female creative artists, like, they're sad, they drink too much, they've got a troubled marriage. It focuses a lot on, it kind of makes her this quite a Gothic figure in and of herself.
Mm.
And to be fair to the writer and the director, they're very clear, this is not a biography. This is based on a novel. She is a character. She's not the actual Shirley Jackson. But of course, understandably, anyone saying that, some called Shirley Jackson and her husband, and
Right.
you're going to think, well, this must be a biography. This is what Jackson was like. And they have extrapolated things, particularly from the first biography about Jackson, things that did happen in real life.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that she did have periods of unhappiness. There was marital difficulties, etc. She did have severe anxiety and depression points. But it's just this sort of wearyingly familiar, like, a woman can't write and be happy. She's
Right.
did that and the other. And
Right.
She's also quite witchy and she's involved in spooky things and she might be a killer. And it's just a bit.
You're like, ugh. Yeah.
I was torn between going, there's a film about Shirley, and then watched it and went, there's a film about Shirley.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't want to diss any of the creative work that went into it because, I think if I didn't know anything about Shirley Jackson, I would have enjoyed it a lot more.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's an interesting film, but I have some issues with the particular spin on Jackson, and I think it's arguably I don't think male writers don't get quite the same coverage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or turning her into, well, first of all, I think any of us would be annoyed if, there was a movie about Meghan DeFord, but it's a fiction. And it's like, well, that's a real person, right? And for the record, I would not spill wine on someone's white sofa on purpose. But it's interesting because I feel like in many circles that to be a successful American author, you have to have depression or alcoholism or be morose or macabre or whatever. If you think about Edgar Allan Poe or, Fitzgerald or whatever, like you have to have these really big personalities with big problems. And heaven forbid,
their dysfunctionality is often featured as more fun or better crack in Ireland. Like they're having a good time. They're having a rip down and drinking too much, but they're having fun they're having moments of having fun, or is there something glamorous about it?
Yeah.
I mean, I wrote an article kind of sort of about Jackson and sort of the Jackson Renaissance recently. So I was looking at, trends in when female creative artists are, there are film biographies of them. What are maybe some of the commonalities? And there is this sense like they're like Judy Garland, and of course Judy
Right.
Garland did a project like, or they're Frida Kahlo. And it tends to be their first name. They're always known by their first name. Like, so it's
Interesting.
Frida, it's Judy, it's Shirley, it's Sylvia
Right.
Plath,
Right.
which is both a very boring film and a very depressing film. So there's that very much that trend. Sorry, dissing for Gwyneth Paltrow now. Just on her. Again, sincere work, but there's a certain kind of like,
Yeah. Yeah. And who would you say are up and coming or more recent authors that you have really enjoyed in that Gothic genre?
Yeah, someone I really like who hasn't written, I wish she would, but hasn't published anything substantial since 2012. She's working a lot in film, is Gillian Flynn. And I think Gone Girl is remarkable. And not to give anything away, but Gone Girl was really incredible things with narrative perspective and with depictions of an angry woman. And it does something very clever in terms of getting us to sympathize with a character who's doing not very sympathetic things. And I think that I think that in a way that Flynn is very much writing in that continuum. There's also people like Katrina Ward, who is a British writer who's writing books that are very, very much, I think, in a Jacksonian. She's also very much doing her own thing, I should say. But someone who is writing a really excellent sort of take on the haunted house book called Raw Blood. One called The Sundial, which is interesting because Jackson also wrote a book called The Sundial. I haven't actually read Ward's The Sundial, so I don't know if there's any overlap there. And one called The Last House on Needless Street, which actually has some interesting overlaps with Jackson, which I actually had the chance to meet Ward, and I was like, is this a Shirley Jackson riff? In a very kind English very Irish and over enthusiastic, and she's very kind to sing. But I read Jackson into everything. But there's people like Daisy Johnson as well. He's another very good British writer. An author called Laura Sims, who did a book called I think it's called I've Been Meaning to Tell You, which is about a librarian, and a new librarian comes into work and may have something mysterious in her past. And actually, Shirley Jackson is referenced a lot in the book itself because they wanted reading Shirley Jackson, and it becomes a kind of weird kind of connection between the women. So she's been a really big, she's been a mammoth influence actually on particularly not just female authored books of this fame, but particularly female authored books. Psychological thrillers, anything to do with a haunted house. It's very hard to get away from Jackson, to be honest. Yeah. Work hard. Like Hill House was such a game changer in a way that it's hard to get away from it in a way. It's such a defining novel of that particular subgenre.
Yeah. Yeah. And is there anything that we didn't, I mean, this has been such a fun conversation. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to make sure listeners know or understand?
Yeah, I would say that if she's an author, you've been thinking, hey, this Shirley Jackson's that's interesting. As I said, I would recommend that you check out We've Always Lived in the Castle. And as you said before, the New Yorker, you will very easily find a really good quality copy of The Lottery online. And if you like The Lottery, my sense is, I would say be prepared because actually her other short stories are generally not like The Lottery at all. And many of them are actually quite very sort of I think much more in a way more sophisticated and more a bit more layered than The Lottery. Not to diss The Lottery because it's very layered too, but she often writes it intrudes into the fantastic in a really interesting way. So she's got an absolutely gorgeous story from the 50s called The Beautiful Stranger, which is kind of about suburban alienation, but it's also kind of about, is my husband really my husband or has he been replaced with somebody else? So I would say, maybe give one of her short story collections a try. The Library of America has two beautiful volumes of Jackson, actually, if you're maybe putting your hand in your pocket a little bit more. Yeah. And they have great introductions by Jackson's most recent biographer, Ruth Franklin, whose 2016 biography is incredible. So if you're interested in a deep dive on Jackson, it's a hefty tome, but it's a really, really good and well-researched biography. And then the second volume is Joyce Carol Oates, who people might have heard of, Gothic legend in her own right. And Twitter legend, just Helen, and someone who's long been interested. And of course, she's a scholar herself. She's actually written interesting stuff about Jackson. So if you're looking for really good kind of apparatus, I would say they're both good. Library of America.
That's
And the
great.
fact that he's in there at all is significant. That's something that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Shirley Jackson not getting in the Library of America.
Yeah, interesting. Well, thank you for your work on that because that has to be, now that people are studying her and talking about her and, you know,
Yeah, there's a few of us, and actually, one nice thing is that there are more people. I mean, I've spoken to academics in Poland, and for some reason, Shirley's quite big in Poland, which is
interesting.
fun. But yeah, so it's really nice too to see it spread out from beyond a kind of an Anglophone perspective. I was at a festival in Barcelona, in November, and they had a whole Shirley Jackson morning, and they had a full house, and I had gave a talk, and we had two panels about Shirley Jackson, and they had been translating Shirley's works into Castilian, which I thought was, or sorry, into Castilian Spanish, which is really cool. Or Catalan, I should say. Sorry,
Catalan, yeah.
any Catalans listening, I sincerely apologize. I should have said Catalan. This is a sentence with you. But it was incredible to see the fact that she's actually getting translated into particularly maybe more, I wouldn't say minority languages, but maybe more local sort of languages as
Right.
well. So
Yeah.
you know,
And it's so cool that I'm sitting here in the south of the United States talking to you in Ireland, and you just mentioned Poland and Spain. And, it's really, I think that's just one of the things that I love most about literature is how it connects us all and how we can all come together about, is my husband, and things like that. This has been so much fun. So you are so passionate about this. I love it. Like I said, I feel like I could just talk to you more and more and more. What do you love most about this study and work that you do?
well, in the case of Jackson, on a personal level, I wouldn't be where I am today, personally or professionally. Shirley Jackson changed my life.
Yeah.
And I was really lucky to, I guess, to work on an author like her who really deserved recognition quite early on. I was sort of in at quite a relatively early stage in Jackson studies, and so that kind of gave me opportunities that maybe were really, were really good. So I think so. The idea too that, I mean, I should say there are other Jackson scholars as well. Her own family have played an incredibly significant role. Her kids played such an important role in promoting her legacy, and particularly very savvy management of her estate has been really significant. So to have played any tiny role at all in helping to propagandize for sure
Yeah.
is actually a privilege, because she really deserves it. And I think Shirley has come back in a massive way. I think too the culture is ready for Shirley Jackson, in a way that maybe it wasn't 30 years ago.
Mhm.
The other thing I'd like to stress is she wasn't an obscure figure in her own time. She wasn't forgotten, and nobody rediscovered Shirley Jackson. She
Right.
wasn't a forgotten figure she was kind of a big deal in her own time, as we talked about the lottery. But she didn't get the respect she deserved, particularly critically. So it's been absolutely incredible to be a really small part of that, and to see that unfold in real time over the course of my own career. For a long time, I couldn't actually teach certain Shirley Jackson novels because we couldn't get them. You have to, in a practical sense, if stuff isn't being made available and published, you can't actually assign it on a course for
Right.
others. So now I can, I could assign pretty much any Shirley Jackson novel, and I know that they're published by Penguin, all of them, so my students can read them. So stuff like that is actually, in a practical sense, really important, that
Yeah.
the next generation can access the material. So that's one of the most exciting parts of it.
That's wonderful. And this is an interesting question in the context of our conversation, but what advice would you have for your younger self?
God, where do I start? I would say wear factor 50 sunblock more regularly.
Well, yeah, sure.
You'd be wearing hats as well. But just a shout out there to all of my pasty kind.
Yes, us similarly pale people.
I never live in Florida. I have to stay in a gloomy country, or I don't really have. I guess what I would say is, try and worry less. I think.
Yeah.
And I think Shirley Jackson's work actually is particularly attractive to people who have degrees of anxiety, because she recognized anxiety incredibly well. And I've been lucky in that I've never, engaged with it to quite the level that Shirley did, or some of her characters did. But I think I would tell my younger self to chill out a bit more. That's kind of very profound intellectual advice. I would also, particularly if someone's thinking about, maybe from a more academic perspective, is find a niche. I didn't even know I'd find a niche. I knew that this writer was great, and more needed to be done on her. And I don't know what made me think, hey, maybe I could do it. So I had no idea what I was at. But I was able to establish what has been, for me anyway, a surprisingly successful career thus far. We'll see how it goes. Because I found a niche that I was able to work within and kind of establish my name within. And I think that could be, it's there's a lot to be said as well for working on interesting angles on better known writers. But in my case, it worked out really well and also to be genuinely interested and passionate about it. Particularly with a PhD, with the academic job market is around the world so much worse than it was even 20 years ago. That's a whole other podcast, Megan.
Yeah.
Both over here, like the UK academia is imploding.
Yeah.
Not great with yourselves in a lot of ways. So you've got to love what you're doing. Keep going. And I
Yeah.
think if you're really passionate about it, I think that makes all the difference.
Yeah, I agree. And I think something that you mentioned about how you were not in academia, like your family wasn't, that wasn't a part of your experience, which is fine. But we actually do, oddly enough, have quite a few listeners who are sort of like 15 through 25, and mostly male, which I also think is very fascinating. Um, but what would you say to someone who, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'll ask it this way. What would you say to someone who maybe at that age, at a younger age, is going down a path that is very different than what they've experienced growing up? And it sounds like you were just following your passion, right? I mean, it wasn't like you were the big bucks with Shirley Jackson.
I genuinely didn't think I'd get a job, to be a fool.
Yeah, yeah. So what would you say to someone who might be worried about that or kind of trying to figure that out?
Yeah, and I think because everyone's personal circumstances are so different, I think what made the huge difference for me is, I mean, I'm from a working class background, and I think people sometimes can be a little bit patronizing and think that working class people don't read. We do.
Yeah.
I always had family support, even within the wider family and the wider community. I had a lot of, like in my village, people would always ask, "Hey, what do you do?"
It's great.
People were proud of you. Everyone knew I was off in Trinity College in Dublin, which is like Trinity's in Ireland's kind of a big deal. It's like
Top
our
notch. Yeah.
yeah, people were. So that made a big difference. I think it would have been a very different proposition if I'd come from a less supportive community, particularly financially. So I mean, I supported myself, but I always knew that if things got really bad, I think I could go back.
Sure.
Live in my old bedroom for a while,
Right.
which made a big difference. So I guess the thing I would do is if there's something that you're truly genuinely passionate about and you feel that you can make a difference in, don't be afraid to pursue it. I mean, one thing I would say is um but try and find a structure that will support it in the best way that you can. And sometimes that means you might necessarily be able to do it when you're 18 or 20 or 25. But to find a way to work within, what you're working with in a practical sense, economically and structurally, that can, gradually make it more and more possible for you. So, I would say, the other thing is get a realistic sense of what it is, the thing that you want to do, what it's actually like. It worked out okay for me, but I genuinely, even when I started my job as a lecturer in popular literature, I didn't really have I knew in some respects, but I didn't have a huge amount of experience. I'd only ever given about four lectures in my life.
Mhm.
I was a lecturer. So the assumption, and particularly in those days in academia, was you'll be good. You've got the PhD. You magically will know how to teach as well. Which it turned out hopefully okay. So I would say, whatever it is that you're interested in short, approach people who are actually doing the thing that you're interested in and ask them for advice. In my experience, like I would semi-regularly get people asking me questions about academia or about, in a general sense. And I'm always really happy to sit down and have a really frank conversation with them about it. So that would be the number one thing, because you may maybe have a slightly unrealistic idea. I mean, I know I certainly did. Most people would. So find out, get a better sense of what it's like. And maybe that there's aspects of it that you would like maybe you're thinking about being an academic, but actually what you're interested in is just the writing part of it and the critical part of it. So
Right.
maybe you kind of hides that off as well. And maybe, do you like academic jobs are actually, particularly when you're at a more senior level, they can be like 60 to 80% administration, actually. So that's the terrible truth. Somebody has to do it, but
Yeah.
we do not spend all our time, unfortunately, writing books or teaching. It's actually very different. So get a realistic sense of what it is you want to do and have a plan.
Yeah.
And the other thing is I would say is, don't be afraid to tell people that what you want to do. I mean, supportive people if it's somebody
Sure.
who's going to, be a rain on your parade, but seek out supportive people because they are out there,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great advice. And how can people find you?
Well, if they come to Trinity College Dublin as one of our students, I am better there. I am not on Twitter anymore. I am on Blue Sky.
Nice.
We both do call it the Twitter breakaway Twitter group. It seems to be mainly academics, from what I can tell. Academics and people following the news.
Yeah.
So my handle there is at Murph Gothic. So @PHGOTHIC. I will say too, we have a network of Gothic and horror studies that we're setting up in here in Ireland, but people from anywhere in the world are welcome to join. We have a film club on Zoom, of course, where we watched most recently Let's Scare Jessica to Death, which is a very Shirley Jackson style 70s hippie horror haunted vampire film. So if you're interested in that kind of thing and a supportive and small community of enthusiasts into horror and Gothic, the Irish Network for Horror and Gothic Studies, and look us up online. We're
Cool.
very, very welcoming crew. So, and anybody, you don't have to be an academic. Absolutely. So,
Yeah. That's great. That's awesome. Well, thank you for spending so much time. This was a really, really fun conversation, and it's what we call in the US spooky season. So it's like,
Oh, yes.
yeah. So this was perfect. And I really hope that people not only learned more about Shirley, but will read more of her work and others' works as well as interacted. Yeah. Yeah. So this was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Megan.
Thanks for listening to Wait, What Do You Do Again? For more information about today's guest, or if you'd like to be on the show, please visit megdeford.com. See you next time.